Hello, everyone. So today we'll be talking about Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which is one of the most famous works of German idealist philosophy and was stated in the previous lecture as one of the fundamental groundworks for postmodern theory. And so today we'll be covering the different sections of the book and their key ideas, which begins with sense certainty, then moving to perception, force and the understanding, self-certainty, reason, and then finally absolute knowing. And after that, we will discuss his concept of dialectics and spirit. And note that spirit will not be defined at the start of this lecture because I personally think it's better to not know the meaning of spirit until you understand the progression of spirit through the different phases of sense certainty to absolute knowing, because it is part of understanding that process in only being able to know the definition of spirit at the end. And the first phase we will talk about is sense certainty, and this is what Hegel calls the first shape of spirit. And it's when an individual consciousness exists, and for Hegel, consciousness is the same thing as existence. And so anything that exists must also be conscious, and anything that is conscious must also exist. And sense certainty is when one uses the senses to experience the world and is only aware of the existence of objects around them, but not what those objects are or what they are caused by. So it's our immediate knowledge of the world around us. We do not even know what the objects are, what they're made of. We only know that they exist. And so it's just the recognition of the existence of objects around us. And self-certainty quickly self-negates itself when it learns of its own inadequacy. So for example, when you say now, you are really referring to a certain time that is not now, maybe slightly into the future or slightly to the past. So for example, if you say, I will drink some water now, you're really saying, I will drink some water in the very near future. Because as soon as you say it, it's no longer now. And you could argue that sense certainty is where animals and humans are the closest, because an animal does not really have a perception of time, which is why they cannot develop complex language systems, which have tenses and talk about time. And they're only aware of the world around them using five senses and only know the existence of things and possibly even of what the things are or what they're used for. But that will be more about the stage of perception, which we will talk about now. So perception begins when sense certainty ends. And instead of just knowing that objects exist, you also know what the objects are. So this is possible by synthesizing different qualities of an object. For example, if you take the apple is red, round, and edible, and then you add your subjective ideas of those qualities onto it. So for example, you might think something that's red, round, and edible is delicious and sweet. And by synthesizing these different qualities, you perceive the object of the apple. And immediately you can see the parallels this idea has with Kant's theory of the synthetic unity of apperception. And that is to do with how a human mind unifies an objective space of appearances with their subjective ideas and innate qualities, or as he calls them, the categories, to perceive and understand objects around them. And another interesting idea Hegel talks about in his section on perception is the idea of concrete universality and how it overdetermines abstract universality. And concrete universality is the manifestation of essence, and essence here is Kant's thing in itself, and the abstract universality is the essence. And so you can think of the concrete universality as the noumenon, the phenomenon, and the abstract universality as the noumenon. And so the concrete is the representation, and the abstract is the form prior to representation, or the essence. And what Hegel means by how the concrete universality overdetermines abstract universality is a reversal of a traditional Kantian idea or German idealist idea, which is that essence comes prior to the representation. And so the phenomenal realm is dependent on the noumenal realm, but yet the noumenal realm is not dependent on the phenomenal realm, and it can exist by itself without the phenomenal realm. But for Hegel, this idea is inherently wrong, and instead, he argues that appearances are where reality begins, and the appearance of perception of something determines its essence. So representations come prior to the thing that is represented, which might seem like a paradoxical idea, but then you can also think of it as how both are equally as reliant on the other. And the idea of a representation coming prior to an essence is very similar to Jean-Paul Sartre's famous quote, "Existence precedes essence," which lays the foundation for existentialism. And this is why Sartre, at least in Being and Nothingness, was just a Hegelian trying to fit Hegelian ideas into a postmodern world. And consciousness for Hegel is either being in itself or being for another. And this dichotomy between being in itself and being for another will be talked about later in this lecture. However, perception cannot explain the unity of the perceptual object. So perception negates itself and proceeds to force into understanding, which is the next section of the Phenomenology of Spirit, which Hegel talks about. And what the unity of the perceptual object is how the apple or the object of perception is synthesized with all of the different qualities. How do we synthesize an objective quality, subjective idea? And what exactly causes this synthesis? And what is the synthesis? How does the synthesis happen? And to explain this, Hegel talks about his idea of force in the understanding. So force is like Newton's equal and opposite reaction, which is a dichotomy between two concepts, both of which are as active and passive as the other. The active necessarily becomes the passive, and the passive necessarily becomes the active. And in the photo, you can see a man watching a TV. So you can say the man is the active watcher of the TV, and the TV is passive and being perceived. But then the photo also illustrates how the TV is also watching the man. So you can say the TV is the active one and the man is the passive one. And Hegel argues that in every situation of perception, the active and the passive distinction is eliminated, and the object of perception and the subject of perception are ultimately serving the same function. And this is why if I'm perceiving the apple, it's equally valid to say that the apple is perceiving me, even if it might sound counterintuitive. And so the perceiver necessarily becomes the perceived. And another core concept in Hegelian philosophy is the idea that negation is affirmative and determinate. And a concept contains within itself its own self-negation. So, for example, Slavoj Žižek, who has been called the leading Hegelian of our time, thinks that political correctness is just as damaging as political incorrectness. And to not be offensive, one must first have a notion of what is offensive, meaning that one would still ultimately be offensive. And this is very similar to the idea of avoiding something that's taboo. If you know something's taboo or stigmatized, then you might feel an urge to avoid that stigma or that taboo, but then you must also already have an idea of why exactly it's taboo or why exactly it is stigmatized, which means that in trying to avoid it, you're sort of acknowledging that you understand what it is, which means that in a sense you are already committing that taboo by acknowledging the existence of the taboo. And this is very similar to something the postmodern scholar Jean Baudrillard wrote in his book Simulacra and Simulation on the Holocaust. He said that part of the Holocaust would be forgetting the Holocaust, and that the forget of extermination is part of the extermination itself. So if you can't ignore something that's negative, then you would have to affirm it. And so Hegel argues that negation is affirmative. However, because of this, it follows that subject is determined by object and vice versa. So our very self-identities are only possible through some force that involves more than just ourselves. And this might be a very interesting idea because traditionally identity is thought of as belonging solely to the person of that identity. But now with Hegel, identity can be considered more of a socially constructed idea and something that's influenced as much by the social environment of a person as the person itself. And this is where self certainty begins. Subjectivity is only possible through objectivity, and objectivity is only possible through subjectivity, as we have talked about earlier. And in one of the most famous passages of the Phenomenology of Spirit, known as the Lordship and Bondage section, but is more commonly referred to as the master slave dialectic, Hegel demonstrates that a master relies on their slave equally as much as the slave relies on them. So, for example, the slave is only able to have food and shelter because of the master, and the master is only able to provide that food and shelter for both the slave and himself because of the slave's work. So there is a sort of codependence between the master and the slave. And in another version of the lordship and bondage dialectic, a master is about to kill a person, but chooses instead to enslave the person for their mutual benefit. And this mutual benefit is what Hegel calls the origin of self consciousness, where a person is only able to know and be certain of themselves through an other, and the other is the slave or the master or any individual or group of individuals external to yourself. And in the picture, you can see how two people acknowledge each other's existences and seek recognition from each other for their existences. And for Hegel, this is what he calls self recognition for the other, which is where self-consciousnesses rise and where consciousness ends. So previously we were only talking about consciousness, but self-consciousness is where a conscious being is conscious of themselves or perceives themselves, and this perception is only possible through the lens of an other. So your identity is only possible by imagining what you are to other people and how that leads to your own self image. So, what you understand as yourself is really what you understand as how others understand you. And this is why societies exist, so that individuals can seek validation from another in order to recognize and actualize their own self consciousnesses. However, for this actualization to be maintained, and the order of different self-recognitions to be continued, we need something called reason. And this is the primary focus of the next section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. And reason becomes necessary so that the different recognitions of the self through the other do not fail. And Hegel famously said that all of world history is a rational process, and hence guided by reason it unfolds towards a certain purpose. And this is why Hegel is sometimes referred to as a teleological view of history, and that is why he believes that spirit moves in a very purposeful way and a very rational way. And self-conscious beings use reason to give moral laws. And you can see this is very similar to Kant's theory of the categorical imperative and the idea of reason as morality. However, these moral laws are never complete because Hegel thinks that reason is still too subjective, as it must originate in a single mind, so it cannot describe something objective. And if you think about it, this makes sense because if there is an idea, then that idea must first begin in a single mind because two people cannot have the same idea at the exact same time. And even if they did, they would not be aware of the other person also having the idea at the same time. And so each idea in the history of ideas must have originated in a single person and their mind. So because moral laws are themselves ideas, moral laws are still subjective and confined to a single subject, even if they are existent within multiple subjects. And Hegel thinks that real morality would be the ethical order, which is a set of unspoken rules about the world and the ways we should act. And this is why Hegel famously said that philosophy should not be edifying, which means that philosophy should not be like some cheap self-help book which tells you how to act correctly or morally, and instead that morality should be unspoken. Morality should be something that's tacit and implicit within the order for universe. But the problem with the ethical order is that it's outside of human reason. And when we try to fit it into our frameworks of reason, the ethical order itself disappears. So it's better to just acknowledge the unknowability of the ethical order, and within that, not develop anything further, and just acknowledge that morality is never a describable system, and we must just acknowledge its indescribability. And Gadamer, who was a postmodern phenomenologist and famous scholar of Hegel, argues that laws ultimately result in their own self-negation and can't accurately describe the world of appearances. And this adds on to Hegel's ideas that laws will always fail because they describe the ethical order, but they can never describe it completely because it is contained within the very definition of the ethical order that it can never be described. And this makes an individual an unhappy consciousness, where you believe simultaneously in contradictory ideas and then oscillate between the two. And for example, Hegel said that all skepticism was the product of unhappy consciousness, because to be skeptic would be to partly believe and partly disbelieve in something, questioning the nature of absolute negation. And you might think this is wrong because if you're skeptical of something, then you would disbelieve in it entirely. But for Hegel, if you're disbelieving in something, then you must at least acknowledge the existence of the thing you're disbelieving in. And agreeing that the thing exists would be believing in a part of the thing. So even if you're absolutely skeptical of something, you would still partly believe in it and also partly disbelieve in it. And this is what causes the unhappy consciousness. And another example of the unhappy consciousness is that of Stoicism, where you try to accept things as they go and embracing fate, embracing whatever happens without showing too much emotion. And Hegel argues that for the Stoic, they're also an unhappy consciousness because they would be partly believing in the idea that things can never be changed, or at least things outside of a Stoic's control are well outside of their control. But then they would also be partly disbelieving in that because they're choosing how they respond to the different changes around them. And they would also be acknowledging the existence of the change in the first place and acknowledging the idea that there is a way to try and change things outside of their control, but that way ultimately fails. So skepticism and stoicism are both examples of the unhappy consciousness. And reason then develops and cultivates itself through culture and religion. Because, as referenced earlier, reason as single ideas can only exist subjectively, but with the progression of spirit, spirit tries to become as all encompassing as possible. So, to make spirit all encompassing, there must be more objective truths in the world. And so, through culture, people are inclined to believe in certain ideas than others, or follow certain rules more than others. And this means that certain ideas become more powerful and dominant than other ideas. And this is where reason is developed. And some rational ideas are considered better than others. And religion sort of links different rational ideas together and provides an overarching framework which allows for reason to be developed even more. So, reason is developed through culture and religion because culture and religion sort of changes the subjectivity of reason into something that's more objective. And here Hegel can be thought of as a pluralist because he thinks that all religions are equally as valid and are just different stages in the progression of absolute spirit. And so there's the traditional analogy of religions as going up the same mountain, but just different paths, and ultimately describing the same truth. But for Hegel's pluralism, it's less about different paths up the same mountain, but rather different parts of the same path. So for Hegel, some religions are more advanced than others in their movement up a certain path. So a religion might be closer to the peak than another religion. And absolute spirit is the driving force behind world history that is unknowable to humans. And absolute means that it is the collection of both subjectivity and objectivity. And in Spinoza's terms, thought and extension create substance, which is roughly synonymous with the Hegelian idea of the absolute, which is everything that is conceivable, possible, or actual. And this is why most people believe Hegel to be a monistic philosopher, which is the belief that everything in the world is part of or made up of a single substance or quality. And you can see this in the pre-Socratics with Thales believing that everything's made of water and Heraclitus thinking everything's made of fire. But for Hegel, everything's part of the absolute. And this is where Hegel often gets a lot of criticism. And Theodor Adorno critiques this Hegelian idea of the absolute by arguing that it's totalitarian, because the ultimate goal of Hegelian philosophy is to make everything part of a single whole or a totality. And Adorno strongly dislikes totalitarianism and thinks it's the groundwork for a political totalitarianism. So that's where he critiques this Hegelian idea of the absolute. And the final shape of spirit is that of absolute knowing. Theoretically, the progression of reason through religion and culture will eventually result in a state of absolute knowing, where everything that has the possibility of being known is known, and everything is actualized. So, Hegel argues that to attain this state of absolute knowing, you must know everything there is to know about knowledge. And this isn't just simple epistemology or theory of knowledge, because for a truly complete system of epistemology, you would have to know every single piece of knowledge that exists or has the possibility of existing. And so for Hegel, absolute knowing is knowing everything there is to know about knowing. Because for that to be possible, you would know what knowing is, how it functions, and more importantly, what exactly the objects of the knowledge are. And he also calls this when spirit knows of itself as spirit. And the phenomenology of spirit is not the journey of an individual consciousness or a group of conscious beings, but instead is the journey of absolute spirit as it actualizes itself in everything. And as individual self consciousnesses, we may think that absolute knowing is impossible because it would be like making a perfect map of Hong Kong. But then that map would have to include ourselves making the map as well, thus resulting in a state of infinite regress. And you can look at the picture on the right, which shows maps within maps, which illustrates this quite well. So if you're trying to make a perfectly scaled, perfectly detailed, perfectly accurate map of Hong Kong, you would also have to include yourself making that map. But with yourself making that map, you would have to include the map that is being made. And then within that, another map, and then another map, and then another map. So it's just a state of infinite regress with turtles all the way down. And that's why humans can believe that absolute knowing is impossible. But perhaps that is exactly why absolute is possible, because our denial of the possibility of absolute spirit is just because we are spirits which do not yet know of ourselves as spirit. So we are confined to the frameworks of human reason, but absolute knowing and absolute spirit transcend all of that entirely. And when spirit knows of itself as spirit, when we come to know ourselves as spirit, no longer thinking in terms of individuals or societies, and simply as the absolute spirit, then we will realize that absolute knowing is possible because we will have just attained it. And dialectics and spirit. So we've come to the end of our summary of the phenomenology of spirit, and we'll be talking more about the general ideas of Hegel's philosophy. So Hegel's dialectic is commonly believed to be thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but that is wrong because he never actually used that phrase in both the phenomenology and in the science of logic, which built upon the ideas in the phenomenology and gave a deeper exploration of the idea of dialectics. And the science of logic I'm referring to here isn't the one in Hegel's encyclopedia, but the individual work, The Science of Logic. And instead, it can be thought of as abstraction, negation, concretion, but even better as something that cannot be schematized and thought of in a linear way, and rather as the movement and progression of spirit through world history. So ultimately, Hegel is a philosopher of history. And another way to think of the dialectic is in terms of being for itself, being in itself, to being for another, and finally to being for itself, which was referenced earlier. So in being in itself, you just have a pure concept, and it's the thing in itself. It's the being that only acknowledges its own existence. And with being for another, the being becomes self conscious and recognizes the objects around it. And finally, it becomes a being for itself, which is the actualization of its freedom. And being for itself, being can be being in itself, being for another, being for itself, can be thought of as both a model for humans and consciousnesses and self-consciousnesses, but also as a model for the movement of ideas. And with the analogy with the abstraction, negation, concretion, that's to do with how an idea begins as purely abstract, then it's negated and exists in a concrete form. But then it's always an infinite cycle because the concrete then moves to become the abstract and then negates itself and then concretes and then abstracts and then negates. And so it just continues forever. And the final stage of this process is called Aufhebung. And Aufhebung is roughly the concretion of the dialectic. And Aufhebung is a German word which translates into English as sublation or sublimation, and is used to describe how dialectics often are used to attain some higher truth. And this higher truth is also called the absolute idea. And the idea that dialectics cannot be thought of in a linear way also linked to how human reason cannot grasp the full extent of dialectics, because dialectics are the movement of everything throughout world history, but we are just humans confined to human logic, and so we cannot fully conceive of the nature of dialectics. And near the end of the book, Hegel finally gives a definition of spirit as either substance, which actualizes itself as self consciousness, or self consciousness that actualizes itself as substance. And substance here is the Spinozist idea of substance, because Hegel began as a bit of a Spinozist. And so spirit is everything, but condensed within just one thing, or one thing which contains within itself everything. And that is, in short, what spirit is. And Hegel is also sometimes thought of as a philosopher of history and a philosopher of freedom. And we talked about how he's a philosopher of history with the idea of spirit moving throughout world history. But as a philosopher of freedom, Hegel argues that as spirit becomes more and more developed, freedom also becomes more and more developed. Because with the development of identity and through self consciousness, then humans are able to have more freedom in the construction of their identity and in the construction of societies, of moral laws through reason. And so ultimately, spirit is also the development and enlargement of freedom, and how freedom becomes more and more available. And spirits can then be categorized to subjective spirit, which is just a consciousness, which then moves to objective spirit, the self consciousness, or rather, how different self conscious beings interact with one another in a network like society. And then the collection of all these different spirits throughout world history is the system of absolute spirit. And absolute spirit is just everything there is or can possibly be condensed within a single form. And all of postmodernism can be understood through the lens of the phenomenology of spirit, and lots of postmodern ideas build upon these fundamental Hegelian notions, and this will be more evident in future lectures. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture today on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit.